sun in the sky. You know how I feel. Breeze drifting on by. You know how I feel. It's a new dawn. It's a new day. It's a new life for me. And I'm feeling good.
Would you look at the time? It's time to talk about current events. The Arab Spring is an ongoing revolutionary movement encompassing the Arab states of the Mediterranean that features protests, riots, and civil wars against political corruption, undesirable economic conditions, and authoritarianism. Many of the leaders that were protested against did not relinquish power peacefully, and the movement is characterized by violence against and by the people. The discontent of the standard of living inspired the revolutionaries to have goals of acquiring democracy, free elections, and a prosperous economy in their nations. It was catalyzed in Tunisia by the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi in December 17, 2010, and spread using the internet. It saw widely publicized revolts in large countries such as Egypt and Libya, and now possibly in Turkey. Let's start with the Yemeni Revolution. The Yemeni Revolution started on the 27th of January 2011 in Sana'a as 16,000 strong mass protests against the drastically lower standard of living most Yemenis tolerated with. In a country with an inept government full of corruption and widespread discontent from unemployment, the revolution didn't need much to ignite. It was inspired by the revolution in Tunisia, and it spread its ideology using social media such as Twitter and Facebook. It proceeded to call for the resignation of Ali Abdullah Saleh, who held power for more than 33 years. Although Saleh promised that he would not run for president in 2013 and would not name his son's successor, angry Yemenis called for his immediate resignation in a day of rage, which usually happens to occur on Friday afternoon prayer time. After multiple demonstrations during many Fridays of February, March, and April that called for an end to Saleh's rule, Saleh agreed to a deal on May 22nd that would have seen him leave power after a month. However, he backed out of the deal, which caused an intensifying of the opposition, which acquired the support of one of the most powerful tribes in the country, the Hashids, led by Al-Ahmar. Heavy fighting ensued as negotiations for a ceasefire failed, and an assassination attempt on Saleh on June 3rd caused him severe injury. This caused Saleh to be evacuated to Saudi Arabia for treatment. A ceasefire was agreed upon as al-Hadi became acting president, but negotiations for a transitional council that would partake the role of overseers of a democratic election failed. Peaceful protests broke out in December, but the soldiers loyal to Saleh opened fire on the civilians. This caused fighting to break out in September 22nd between Saleh's troops and Al-Ahmar's. A day later, Saleh returned to the country undergoing political turmoil that saw gun battles on the streets of the capital. On November 23, 2011, Saleh finally signed a treaty promising that he will legally transfer the presidency to the vice presidents al-Hadi within 30 days and would step down formally by the president's elections of February 25, 2012, in exchange for immunity from the prosecution for himself and his family. Al-Hadi won 99.8% of the vote and would serve only 2 years while overseeing the drafting of a new constitution. The Yemeni Revolution radically changed Yemen from a nation under the 33 years of direct rule by an authoritarian ruler into a nation of democracy that had a government that sought to work, represent, and fight for the people. It is just a small yet still important piece of the Arab Spring movement itself, and represents the immense influence social media has in shaping government and society. It is also proof that the will of the people is paramount in the survival of the government, and that the unpopular ones cannot test the test of time. Now let's talk about Syria. Syria is known to be one of the biggest causes of the biggest roles in the Arab Spring. This began on March 15, 2011, in the southern town of Sarat. Syria's armed conflict first began between the forces loyal to the Syrian Ba'ath government and the Syrians, or as others are against it. The Day of Rage. Syrian protesters' main goal is to overthrow and make a resignation of President Bashar al-Assad, whose family held the presidency since 1971, as well as to end the Ba'ath party rule. To this day, revolts and many deaths are caused due to the armed conflict between these two forces. The first year of casualty of the Syrian civil war was to be known to be over 9,000 deaths. To this day, casualties are in the high numbers between 70,000 to almost 100,000 deaths. These numbers do not only include the two forces, but they also have the deaths of many innocent lives that do nothing to get involved in this. To this day, Syria is still raging and demonstrating for more freedom. One way the protesters were able to do these kinds of things was by taking advantage of social media, where members use Twitter to update news and use YouTube as propaganda to motivate protesters. Reasons of Syrian protesters revolting were many. How it began was described on March 2011 in a city in Syria called Daraa. Few high school students painted on the school wall some sentences against the president, Bashar al-Assad, his regime that somehow the police were informed about. So they came into school and arrested the kids that took him to the unknown place. So the family started looking for the kids, and when they couldn't find a hold of them, they went to the internal forces, wondering where are their kids, but they were asked to go back home and to forget about the kids. And then the whole families and relatives gathered and started a protest at the city hall. 1 week after that, the kids were released, and signs of torture were on their body. So because of the government's tyranny, they protested again, and it expanded in every and each Syrian city, calling for freedom and justice. But unfortunately, al-Assad's forces starting to shoot, kill, and kidnap anyone that they could catch among the protesters. Arab Spring continues to take a big toll, and it's continuing to have many more casualties. Many reports are continued to this day, and many more innocent lives are taken each day. Freedom and justice are still fought out. The predications of the Syrian civil war is still very shaky, but it has been going on for a very long time. Therefore, the Syrian uprising may continue for an extremely long time. Now let's talk about Egypt. Arab Spring in Egypt consisted of a diverse movement of demonstrations, marches, plaza occupations, riot, non-violent civil resistance, acts of civil disobedience, and labor strikes. Millions of protesters of varying backgrounds banded together and attempted to throw the regime of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. There were various Islamic, anti-capitalist, and feminist movements. So far, skirmishes between civilians and protesters and government has resulted in over 800 casualties and 6,000 injuries. The revolution rose to a point where at least 90 police stations were burned by protesters. However, international media, along with government propaganda, attempted to undermine the extent and severity of the revolt. The revolt focused mainly on political and legal issues, such as freedom of speech, police brutality, government corruption, inflation, unemployment, and low wages. The uprising was described as a war zone. Majority of the revolution took place in Cairo, Egypt's capital. The Central Security Force, loyal to Mubarak, were gradually replaced by military troops. This dramatically increased the amount of looting and chaos inside Cairo, because there was no one to control the protesters. The military did not enforce the same curfew and laws that the police originally enforced. In response to the increased crime, communities formed watch groups in order to protect themselves along with the community. After the revolts, Mubarak dissolved his government and installed Omar Suleiman as vice president in order to pacify the revolts. The power was turned over to the military, who would rule until elections restarted. On June 30th, 2012, Mohamed Morsi was inaugurated as 5th president, over a year after the revolutions dissolved and the regime of Mubarak. Now let's talk about Libya. Libya's revolution started on February 15, 2011, when citizens began protesting in Benghazi. They protested against the tyranny of Gaddafi, his dictatorship over the country. Although the country was in good conditions, as living standards, life expectancy, and literacy increased, the government had full censorship and control over almost all the press, and Libya was rated the most censored state in the Middle East and North Africa by the Freedom of Press Index. The government was also harsh, keeping intense and tight control of all its citizens and created a duplicate of the Reign of Terror. They executed all the dissidents in the country and would broadcast these horrible executions. These actions generated fear in Libyan citizens, dissuading them from ever rebelling. On February 15, 2013, an action sparked many to start rebelling. Civilians protesting in Benghazi against the government were shot down by military officers. The protesters responded by throwing rocks and sieging the town and succeeded in taking over the town. This sparked many other cities in Libya to start revolting, which resulted in 10 other cities to come under rebel control. The resulting two parties were the anti-Gaddafi force and the Gaddafi loyalists. The battle was a seesaw, shifting in favor back and forth, until the rebels finally managed to take over most of Libya, with the help of the UN forces, in late August and created a new country. The revolt of Libya shows the destructive of governments through the tyrannical actions led by Gaddafi. These actions include the censorship of media and tight control over citizens. It also displays how effective social media is in organizing and the collaboration of forces, and the global connection as the UN and NATO aided Libya in the revolts.
Some of the causes of the Arab Springs are the fact that very old regimes ruled for long periods of time. Because these are very old regimes, they're very paranoid over other parties to control, and because of this, they were very strict and intense in their control. They violated many of the human rights of their citizens, such as monitoring them and censoring the media, and conducting executions, public executions.
Social media also helped to facilitate these revolutions. For example, in Egypt, the whole revolution began on Facebook, where one man created a Facebook group in order to gain support against the beatings of men.
One of the biggest effects of the Arab Spring include many deaths. These deaths include deaths of innocent lives as well. For example, in Syria, the 94,000 that are killed don't include just the protesters, but they also include many innocent lives. One of the biggest effects include
democracy.
And can you tell me more about that?
Democracy.
And what are some effects of that?
DEMOCRACY.
And how does that make you feel?
Democratic.
And how has this affected your life?
Democracy.
Thank you for your input.
Miss Decker, we wrote a song for you. Yeah. Class of 2050, thank you, Miss Decker, you've been so kind. Your lessons are always on my mind. This year has been such a blast. Too bad the school year won't always last. In the beginning of the year, we would compare and contrast. We all thought we were really trash. But then we did start your brains to watch historical films and learn from Crash Course. John Wick. And our knowledge increased exponentially. It became a compelling force. Then AP exams came around. We studied day and night, we didn't hit the town. We woke up 6 in the morning and went to the fairgrounds. Rode our CCOTs and ran around. Now we're singing about this project better than all American rejects. Give us an A, it will make our day. Thanks, Miss Decker, for a wonderful year. We'll make your new visit to a your birthday this very year. James Simpson!
Thank you, Miss Decker!
Swag.
Yeah!
That was so good.
Alright.